At the parents' wedding anniversary dinner, the atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and smiles as family members chatted excitedly about the years gone by. Everyone seemed so happy, celebrating another milestone in the family's history. The parents, sitting at the head of the table, suddenly made a grand announcement that took the room by surprise. "We're going to Hawaii next week for another big family party," they said, their voices full of excitement. The news was met with immediate cheers, hugs, and congratulations. The rest of the family rallied around, talking about what to pack, how fun the trip would be, and all the memories they would make together. In the midst of the celebration, the protagonist, still sitting at the table, quietly asked, "What time is the departure?" expecting a simple answer, maybe a bit of information to join in on the excitement. But the response that followed cut through the air like a cold, sharp knife. The father looked up from his glass, his face stern, his voice emotionless. "You're not coming with us," he said, the words hanging in the air, heavy with disdain. "You're not part of this family anymore. Stay here and take care of all the kids." The weight of those words seemed to suck the life out of the room, leaving a stillness in its wake. The once joyful chatter stopped instantly, and the smiles that filled the room faded as everyone turned to look at the protagonist. In that moment, the world seemed to shrink, the laughter from earlier now distant and hollow. The protagonist sat there, stunned, the humiliation burning through their chest. It felt like the ground beneath them had shifted, and the family they thought they belonged to had just cast them aside. The celebration, once so full of life, had turned into an awkward, suffocating silence. The protagonist had been publicly rejected in front of everyone, exposed as an outsider in a place they once thought was home. And that's when the protagonist decided to drop the bomb that would change everything. With a quiet resolve, they realized that the time for silence was over. The pain, the rejection, and the isolation would no longer go unspoken. The carefully hidden resentment had been building up for years, but now it would all come out. Revenge would come, and it would come in the most unexpected way. The protagonist sat there in silence, their mind racing. They tried to keep their composure, but inside, everything felt like it was crumbling. The humiliation from the father's words was unbearable. They had expected to feel disappointment, perhaps even confusion, but what hit them was something deeper, more visceral: betrayal. The very family they had once thought would always have their back had just cast them aside without a second thought. The sting of that reality echoed through their chest, and for a moment, it was almost impossible to breathe. The room seemed to close in, the faces of their relatives blurring around them as the weight of exclusion pressed in on every side. Anger bubbled up from deep within, but it was laced with a deep, aching hurt. How could they not see how this would affect them? How could their father speak to them like that, as if they were nothing more than an afterthought? The confusion turned to disbelief as they glanced around the table, wondering if anyone would speak up, if anyone would defend them. But no one did. The rest of the family remained silent, as if the words didn't matter, as if the protagonist's feelings didn't matter. They were alone. Just like they had always been. But as the emotional turmoil raged inside them, something else began to shift, a quiet, dangerous resolve. The hurt and anger began to form into something more tangible. Revenge. At first, it seemed like a passing thought, a fleeting impulse, but it settled in like a weight they could no longer ignore. The protagonist found themselves beginning to think about how they could make their family feel the same sting they had felt, how they could turn the tables, how they could show them the cost of rejecting someone who had always been there. As they quietly excused themselves from the table and made their way to the bathroom, they stared at their reflection in the mirror. What had once been a family, united and loving in their eyes, now seemed like a group of hypocrites, people who spoke of love but acted in cruelty. The realization was sharp and bitter. The protagonist had been wrong all along, believing in something that wasn't true. They had never been part of this family. And now, they would make sure the family knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that kind of rejection. The seed of revenge had been planted, and there was no turning back now. As the protagonist stood there in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to steady their breath, the harsh sting of their father's words echoed in their mind. It was as if the world had gone silent, leaving only the memories of past moments that had shaped their feelings of isolation and hurt. The weight of those moments came flooding back, each one a sharp reminder that they had never truly been a part of the family they'd always tried so hard to belong to. There was the birthday party, the one that was supposed to be special, but instead, it felt like a cruel joke. It was the protagonist's 10th birthday, a day they'd looked forward to for months. They had imagined everyone gathered around, singing and laughing, celebrating them. But as the day unfolded, it became clear that no one had remembered. The cake wasn't even for them, it was for the family's favorite child, their older sister, whose birthday had passed just a few weeks prior. The protagonist stood there, feeling invisible, as their family sang happy birthday to their sister, their voices echoing in the protagonist's ears, the sharpness of exclusion cutting deep. They tried to smile, but it felt like a mask they could no longer keep up. Then there were the countless times the parents showed obvious favoritism. The protagonist's younger brother always seemed to get the better treatment. Whether it was the car he got for his 16th birthday or the praise he received for the simplest accomplishments, it was always clear that he was the golden child. The protagonist's own achievements were met with indifference. When they got a scholarship, it was brushed aside as if it were no big deal. But when their brother received the same recognition for a much smaller feat, it was like the world had been made to revolve around him. The disparity wasn't just in material things, it was in the love and attention given, too. The protagonist began to understand, through these repeated instances, that they were never going to be the favorite, never going to be the one celebrated or cherished. And the times their struggles went unnoticed were the most painful of all. When the protagonist had been going through a tough time in high school, struggling with bullying and feeling lost, no one seemed to notice. They poured their heart out to their parents, only for their mother to brush it off, telling them to be strong and move on. The protagonist could never understand how the same issues, if they had happened to their brother or sister, would have garnered all the attention. The lack of support was suffocating, leaving the protagonist to deal with everything alone, without a shoulder to lean on. Each of these moments built up resentment, layer by layer, until it was too much to ignore. The incident at the dinner, the final blow, wasn't a random act. It was just the latest in a long history of neglect, exclusion, and favoritism. The protagonist's heart hardened with the realization that they had never been seen, never truly been part of the family. These memories, painful as they were, now fueled the fire inside them. Revenge wasn't just a response to a single event, it was the culmination of years of being overlooked, unappreciated, and rejected. And now, it would all come crashing down. The protagonist stood there, alone in the bathroom, still staring at their reflection in the mirror. Their hands were trembling slightly, but it wasn't from fear, it was from something deeper, something that had been building up for years. The betrayal from their father, the public rejection at the dinner, it had all piled up to this moment. They had been wronged, and the weight of that wrong had been pressing on them for so long that it could no longer be ignored. The hurt, the anger, the years of feeling less than, of being treated like an outsider, it all demanded to be addressed. No more silence. No more pretending. The decision was made. The protagonist would exact revenge. It was the only thing that made sense now. For too long, they had suffered in silence, taking the pain of being overlooked, dismissed, and ignored. No longer. The family had pushed them to this point, and now it was time for them to feel the consequences of their actions. It wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about making them understand, making them regret the way they had treated the protagonist all these years. It was time to take control of their own story. The first step in the plan came quietly, subtle manipulations, small interactions that were meant to plant seeds of doubt. A carefully placed comment here, a slight dig there, things that seemed innocent at first but would slowly start to build tension. The protagonist knew how to use their family's weaknesses against them, how to push their buttons without them even realizing what was happening. It was a game, but the stakes were real. But even as they began to execute their plan, an internal debate raged inside. Should they really go through with this? Could they just walk away and try to move on, forgiving their family and letting it go? The pain was immense, but so was the temptation for justice. Forgiveness felt impossible, and the betrayal was too deep. The protagonist knew, without a doubt, that there was no going back now. Revenge wasn't just an option, it was the only thing that could bring some sense of closure. The protagonist's plan began to take shape quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. It was all about subtlety, about working from the inside, planting seeds that would grow into full-fledged chaos. They started by focusing on the cracks in the family's facade, the things that no one ever spoke about but that were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. They knew that mistrust within the family would be the key to everything. It was easy to target the deep-rooted rivalries between siblings, so the protagonist began sowing doubt. First, they whispered small, seemingly innocent remarks to their older sister, comments about how the parents favored the younger brother more than anyone else, how the father's praise for him seemed hollow and manipulative. They made sure their sister's insecurities about her place in the family were amplified, slowly turning her feelings of resentment into open hostility toward the brother. At the same time, the protagonist began planting subtle doubts in the younger brother's mind. They would mention how the mother often spoke ill of him behind his back, how her expectations were always impossibly high, but that she never seemed to see his true efforts. Next, the protagonist shifted their attention to the parents themselves. They started making little comments, disguised as casual observations, to make the parents question each other's actions. When their mother was in the kitchen, the protagonist would casually drop a remark about how the father had been making secret decisions about the trip without consulting her, how he made sure to exclude the protagonist intentionally from every important family event. The goal wasn't just to cause tension, it was to turn the family's perception of each other upside down, creating a mess of accusations, doubts, and half-truths that would eventually unravel their unity. As the plan took form, the tension in the house began to build. The protagonist watched from the sidelines, a quiet observer as the first signs of discord rippled through the family. The once cohesive unit now felt fragmented, with every conversation laced with suspicion. The hypocrisy of the family was starting to become clearer. The parents had always painted themselves as the pillars of support and love, but now, cracks in their perfect image began to show. The siblings, who had once seemed so united, were now fighting over imagined slights, unaware that the protagonist was the silent hand pushing them apart. The deeper the protagonist became entrenched in their plan, the harder it was to ignore the growing emotional cost. Every subtle manipulation, every small act of betrayal, began to weigh on their conscience. They started to feel the burden of the guilt pressing down on them, the realization that they were sacrificing their integrity to get back at those who had wronged them. But still, the desire for revenge burned brighter. The family had destroyed what little trust had remained, and now the protagonist was willing to pay any price to make them feel the same way. The plan had taken on a life of its own, and there was no turning back. The protagonist couldn't stop now, not when the stakes had grown so high. As the days passed, the shift in the protagonist's behavior didn't go unnoticed. The once outgoing, easygoing family member had become distant, cold, and cryptic. The subtle provocations and manipulations had begun to take their toll. The family could sense something was off, but no one could quite pinpoint the cause. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt strained, and the protagonist's silence only added to the tension. It didn't take long for family members to start confronting them. The younger sister was the first to speak up, asking, "What's going on with you? You've been so distant lately." The protagonist brushed her off with a vague answer, making it clear they didn't want to engage. This only pushed the family further away, creating a noticeable rift. The situation escalated quickly. Sides were drawn. Some family members began defending the protagonist, wondering if there was something they weren't seeing, perhaps the protagonist had been wronged, after all. But others, including the parents, accused them of being difficult, ungrateful, and manipulative. The protagonist didn't bother to correct their assumptions, letting the tension rise. Then came the pivotal argument. The father, visibly frustrated, snapped, "What's really going on with you?" The question hung in the air, but the protagonist refused to answer. Instead, they let the silence speak for them, leaving the family in a state of confusion and growing mistrust. The tension was thick, and the rift between them all seemed irreparable. The tension had reached its boiling point. The family was gathered, trying to act like nothing had changed, but the rift was palpable, an undercurrent that no one could ignore. The protagonist stood at the center of it all, their heart pounding, knowing this was the moment. It was time to drop the bombshell, to reveal the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. With a sharp breath, the protagonist finally spoke, their voice steady but laced with anger. "You think I've been difficult, ungrateful, manipulative? Let me show you what it really feels like to be treated like you don't matter," they said. The room went silent, everyone frozen in shock as the protagonist unleashed their truth. "All these years, I've been watching you, listening to your lies, pretending to be part of a family that never cared about me. I've been left out and ignored, but I'm done pretending. I've been manipulating you all, just like you've been manipulating me." The bombshell hit hard. The family sat stunned, unable to process the reality that had been right in front of them. The protagonist's words echoed through the room, challenging everything they believed. Emotions erupted, accusations flew, and the carefully constructed family dynamic cracked wide open. This was the breaking point. The revenge had been exacted, and the consequences were more than anyone could have imagined. The divide had never been so clear. The family was left in stunned silence, the emotional chaos of the confrontation still hanging in the air. Everyone retreated to their corners, processing the fallout in their own way. The protagonist stood amidst the wreckage, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. They had gotten what they wanted, revenge, justice, whatever they wanted to call it, but now, it didn't feel like enough. The anger that had fueled their actions slowly began to dissipate, leaving behind a hollow feeling, a quiet ache in the pit of their stomach. The family was broken, and yet, the protagonist felt no peace. They thought revenge would bring closure, a sense of validation that they had been right all along. But as the silence settled, all they felt was the weight of the damage they'd caused. They had torn apart what was left of their family, but in doing so, they had also torn something inside themselves. As they looked out the window, watching the sunset, the protagonist realized that while revenge had been justified in their eyes, it hadn't brought the freedom they had hoped for. "I thought revenge would make me whole," they whispered to themselves. "But all it did was leave me more lost than before." The emotional scars were deeper now, and peace seemed further out of reach than ever.